Welcome to today's episode of Print to Pixel, the podcast where we talk to marketing leaders and technologists about how omnichannel marketing is revolutionizing the way that direct mail and digital marketing work together. My name is Dennis Kelly. I'm the CEO of Postalytics, the leading direct mail automation platform that makes direct mail marketing as easy as email. I'm excited today to speak with Josh Gryniewicz of Odd Duck LLC. Josh is a social change commentator who uncovers the power of storytelling in driving system change. Recognizing the pivotal role of narrative plays in shaping perspectives, he combines his formal studies in creative writing and literature with his professional training in public interest communication, social marketing, and behavioral change. Josh, welcome to Print to Pixel.
Excellent. Thanks, Dennis. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Well, super psyched to have you. The description that I pulled to describe what you do is really unique. I haven't had an interview like this. We've had 40 plus interviews. This is the first that I've had with somebody with this type of background. So I'm super interested to dive in. Tell us, the listeners here, how you've gotten to this point in your career where you're now helping to shape change through narrative. Give us a little bit of your story about the key events that led to this point.
I'd love to. Thank you, Dennis. So my background and my training is really in more health communication. That's how I came in. I'm a writer, really kind of segued into public health communication, a lot of behavior change and kind of learning aspects through that. Going on about 20 years ago now, maybe 15, 20 years ago, I was working for a somewhat controversial public health program. It was a public health approach to public safety. And I was the director of communications there. And a lot of what I did was sort of a lot of what I believe your listeners do. So kind of a jack of all trades, wearing multiple hats, doing a lot of marketing, doing a lot of communication, media outreach, and so on. And a large part of my charge, we're based in Chicago. I live in Chicago, and so a large part of my charge was actually to help kind of roll out a national replication of this model. At the time, Dennis, we had 4 university evaluation. These were the experts in the field demonstrating the effectiveness of the model, up to 68% reductions in shootings and killings when this model was being implemented. And so I expected my job to be a breeze, right? Like, who doesn't want those kind of reductions, that kind of impact in their city? And I thought, okay, once this multi-university evaluation comes out, these are the professionals. Every city is going to roll out the red carpet. They're going to welcome us. My job is being done for me. Easy. That did not happen.
Shocking.
Shockingly, that did not happen. Probably a few other experts in criminal justice and public health read the evaluation. Some cities got copies, but the red carpet wasn't rolled out. Nobody sent cars to the airport to pick us up. And so after about a year of it, I think we were replicating in maybe a couple dozen sites in Illinois, and we had some replications in Baltimore. Around that time, a documentary film came out profiling the work of 3 of the activists who were doing the violence interruption work on the ground, who were doing sort of the conflict mediation aspects of the work. That documentary did not get into the too deep into the science behind it, into the evaluation, into some of the metrics that demonstrated it. What it did, Dennis, was it told the story of those three kind of principal workers and their day-to-day lives, the impact that they were having in the streets doing this conflict mediation. And lo and behold, once the documentary was released, it had to release it at Sundance, and then it rolled out to around 200 theaters nationwide over the course of a year, and then premiered on Frontline on PBS. And each one of those had separate sort of engagement strategies, which might be fun for your listeners to hear us kind of pick apart. But everything that we thought was going to happen with that multi-university evaluation ended up happening with the documentary. We grew to 52 sites nationwide, and then now I believe being implemented in 110 sites around the country. I haven't been there in quite a while, but I'm still connected to the organization. And I said, there is something to this story piece. For social change work, for community change work, there is something to the story piece. So what I did was I went back to grad school for creative writing and literature. And I went, how can I marry this discipline with what I've already learned from, health communications and kind of more of a general marketing approach? And so that was really the origins of Odd Duck, of my agency. And it kind of marries those passions of how do you use effective strategic storytelling and narrative framing to advance various social issues and social causes. And I've been doing that since for the last 5 years now with the agency.
That's awesome. And so that formative experience going through this process and then ending up with the documentary really seems to have perhaps shifted your perspective on how nonprofit organizations can drive change through their messaging. And you've created a framework that you are working under. And so tell us a little bit about Hope-Centric messaging. What does it mean?
Yeah.
How does it play out? And why is it something that nonprofits ought to be thinking about?
Yeah, so we have what we refer to as a narrative framework. It essentially maps the change that you want to make, the social change, the initiative that you're advancing, whether that's through an advocacy campaign, a community issue, a more global issue, right? And we begin with visioning. What does the world look like once that work has been achieved, right? So we, essentially begin with the end in mind, and paint as vivid a picture as we possibly can of what that reality looks like. And then we work backwards from there, Dennis. So, essentially, who are the audiences? Who are your yays? Who are your nays? Who do you need to persuade to actually achieve this successfully? We identify those audiences. We identify the actions that we want those audiences to take. And then we work backwards. What are the barriers that those audiences have in taking those actions? And how do we appeal to them to overcome, with their own language, that's important, to overcome those barriers, right? We narrow it down ideally to 4 core audiences. Sometimes we can go as high as 6. I don't recommend any more than that. As you know, if you're trying to message to everyone, you're messaging to no one at all. And we embed whatever messaging and appeal that we develop with those audiences through key informant interviews, research. We lean more heavily on psychographics than demographics. So kind of conducting interviews, conducting focus groups, community listening sessions, and so on. And we embed the messaging that we develop out of that into the stories that we tell. And so then we have an idea. The narrative framework is essentially a story map. And we have an idea, a scaffold of what stories do we need to curate, what stories do we as an organization for my clients need to tell, what channels are those audiences hanging out on and prefer to get information from, right? And how do we tailor that message, again, in their language, directly to them and in a way that's appropriate to those channels?
Sure. That all makes perfect sense. And, I think across marketing, whether you're talking about nonprofit or for-profit commercial marketing, this notion of matching up audience to message and words is really universal, right? Across any type of outreach. You need to truly understand your audience first, and then layer in messaging frameworks that appeal to the particular segments that you are trying to penetrate and grow with. So I think it makes a ton of sense now. But let's get back to this notion of hope-centric messaging.
Yeah.
Where did you develop that, and help us understand why that sort of stands out here in this world of nonprofit outreach?
Well, so what I'll say initially is I feel like there is a tendency to want to push messaging, especially when it's advocating for change, through either a shame-based or a fear-based lens. And it's almost the default, right? We have a very standard script for appeals, for advocacy language, even grants and fundraising, right? Where we build out sort of the problem approach. Here's the problem, here's the approach, here's how we uniquely fit into this, and then here's what will happen if you invest your hard-earned dollars in our initiative. But what we found is, that those emotions, right? Shame, fear, they have a tendency to close us off, right? So if we were having a one-on-one conversation, we wouldn't even want to trend in that direction, right? If I'm scaring you, you're not really listening to what I have to say. If I'm shaming you, you definitely don't want to hear what I have to say, right?
Right.
But somehow we think, we interpret, and oftentimes when I'm giving a presentation or I have a keynote around this, oftentimes when I'm talking to a group, they get it fundamentally. But then when we're actually developing some of the content, some of the appeals, they're like, no, because there's a fear on our end as an organization that the message just isn't going to cut through. And so what I'll say is, depending on the campaign, there is a place for that. Sometimes people do need to be shamed. Sometimes fear is a good spotlight to put on an issue to say, oh my God, if we do X, Y, and Z and we don't have this intervention, then bad things are going to happen, right? And so there is a place where you get like a kind of spike in responses, in people paying attention. But if we're talking about long-term change, real investment in the community over a long period of time, right, then a hope-centric messaging, which, going back to the narrative framework, that begins with visioning, that begins with what is the world we're trying to create and how do we achieve or get to that world. That is something that people can hold on to for a lot longer a period, right? And those emotions, the hope emotions, optimism, joy, love. Those are open emotions, right? Those are emotions where if we're experiencing that emotionally, again, one-on-one, if I'm love bombing you, Dennis, you're going to be like, I want to hear more of what Josh has to say. He's making me feel really good about myself, right? And so we're more receptive to those messages. So part of it is figuring out the balance. And again, some of that's audience dependent, some of that's channel dependent. But overall, keeping that hope-centric piece, even if you're using some fear tactics, keeping that hope-centric piece front and center of everything is crucial.
Front and center, I agree. I think this notion of fear versus hope, right, is really powerful.
Yeah.
They are such different things, such different emotions. My belief is that fear-based messaging has a short shelf life, as you're pointing out, because I think it extracts energy. When you hear fear-based messaging, and Lord knows we're hearing enough of that today
Absolutely.
in this world that we live in.
Absolutely.
You can only have so much, because it will just pull you down into a place you don't want to spend a lot of time in. And so maybe it'll get a sharp, quick reaction for something urgent, but you can't build anything repetitive on that or anything long term. Where my perception, a hope-based message fills me with energy. I want to engage with my energy because it's giving me energy back, as opposed to sucking all my energy down that TV tube or social media feed that happens
the
on
doom
a daily
scroll,
basis.
the endless doom scroll. Yes. And the other aspect of that too, Dennis, is that, when you think about it, right, once we sit with that fear, there's diminishing returns to that fear.
Yeah.
Right? At a certain point, we hit saturation and we just want to go offline. We want to check out. We're not listening to the message anymore. The same way one-on-one is true of our audiences. They're going to hit compassion fatigue. They're going to be overwhelmed. They don't want to hear it anymore. Right? Whereas with the hope-centric, it's not just, and this is one thing when working with groups around hope-centric messaging, one of the concerns that they often put forward, there's always somebody in the audience who will raise their hand and ask this of me. And isn't this a little Pollyanna-ish? Aren't we just creating fantasies? Are we ignoring the reality of what's going on around us? And I always respond with, no, absolutely not. You're anchoring the hope-centric messaging in a vision that you can actually hold on to. The change, why are we working on these campaigns in the first place? We want to have transformative change. And so, there are other problems if we don't believe we'll actually get there, and that's above my pay grade. But if we actually believe in the work that we're doing and the change that we're trying to make, then we can also believe and invest in the vision of that outcome, right? And the hope-centric messaging, the idea isn't just an ambivalent hope, it's a hope to actually build that success at the other end of this campaign.
Right. Yeah. Love it. Let's transition a little bit.
Sure.
And start to dive into maybe some specific examples of how you have implemented this framework, and then how that has drilled down into the actual execution of campaigns. So tell us a story about one of your customers and how this has been implemented.
Well, I think two of the most effective examples that I've seen, and I will fully admit that this wasn't our entire soup to nuts narrative framework. These were campaigns that we were kind of reporting on and recording after the fact, but still highly effective and really in a lot of ways informed our lens on how we approach this. both of these were around vaccine hesitancy when the vaccines started rolling out. And a lot of the discussion, one of them was with a group called Chromatic Black, um, who we've worked with and done a lot of work with, who are a phenomenal group, also a storytelling organization. And the other was the National Indian Health Bureau. And very similarly, the National Indian Health Bureau, their campaign was Act of Love. Chromatic Black, their campaign was Keep Black Love Alive. And each of these groups, when the conversations first started, it was a scary time, right? Like we neither knew, what the vaccines were going to do. These were all new. We were coming out of a global pandemic. That aspect of it hasn't been experienced for generations, right? And so there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of concern. And, the idea of doubling down on the fear aspect of it, right? And saying, okay, well, get this vaccine or, quite literally it could lead to death, right? Just didn't seem like an effective message to get traction. And the group at Chromatic Black, they came up with well, why don't we use more of messaging around keeping Black love alive, investing in the community, loving one another, and doing this as your individual act is contributing to the betterment of the community as a whole. Same with the native population with their campaign. These two campaigns, too, Dennis, were concurrent. There were the organization worked with nearly 2,500 community-based organizations in nearly 300 communities to do various overcoming vaccine hesitancy. And it was, again, a multi-channel, but with that hope-based messaging across all platforms. So for the Act of Love, they worked with several different tribal groups. They recruited tribal artists from the community to do things, artwork that was indigenous to their community. Absolutely beautiful, sent out postcards, reminders, and so on. And the return on investment, they increased the vaccine rates in a way that wouldn't have happened if it was standard issue, a public health briefing or an email or letter in the mail saying, hey, this is where you get the vaccine. The fact that it was so baked into the culture and so oriented toward possibility, hope, and love, again, open-ended messaging, right? That open emotion, right, allowed the audiences, the recipients, to actually receive that message and take action.
Very cool. I think that this idea of having a framework like that can then get executed in a lot of different ways, right? And you don't have to have the exact same words describing the emotion you're trying to generate, but
100%.
But you can vary it, but have a theme that you're all tying back to that is positive, looking forward and not backward. And I think ultimately in any culture, if there is hope, then people want to get up in the morning. People want to do more, right? And so it all makes perfect sense. You touched on there for a moment this idea of this messaging framework laying down across multiple channels, and this podcast is about omni-channel marketing. So let's talk a little about that, right? Like how does a framework work in, let's say, direct mail and email and digital? How does messaging lay down across those various channels?
Yeah. So again, for how we approach it with the narrative framework begins with that vision, right? Doing the visioning exercises, really trying to paint as vivid a picture as possible of what all of these efforts are pointing to, right? Now, part of this is to make sure that we have alignment among our audience, but part of it is also so that we have alignment in our messaging. We want to be as consistent as possible while also using our audience's language. You know, there's often disconnects in how things are communicated, right? Even with the same message, the same campaign, and the same audience, we may not receive things differently because we're channeling it through our value system. So that's part of that, what we refer to as a story map, which is really the centerpiece of a narrative framework. And that story map, again, it identifies your core audiences. It identifies the action you want them to take. All of those actions, Dennis, pointed to that vision that you've created, right? And then the barriers and the appeal. And then the appeal comes up as, you know, the real kind of baked in messaging. And then we figure out the channels from that once we have that story map fleshed out. So part of the exercise with the barriers, when we're getting groups to identify the barriers, you know, you're going to have some barriers that are just you know, like they're not communication problems. Right? You know, transportation. If you're talking about getting a family to a community center, and you know they don't have the money for public transportation, or public transportation doesn't run to this community center, then that's a disconnect. So we put that in the parking lot, and we may be able to come up with solutions for that, but that's not what we're focused on. What we're really focused on are those psychosocial emotional barriers, right? And what we do when we really know that we're making magic happen, when we can turn those barriers into questions, right? When we can actually frame those barriers as questions, and then the embedded messaging, the appeal part, is an answer to the question, so that our audience feels as if we are reading their mind. We are answering the question before they've even posed it, right? And then again, a lot of what we do with the psychographics, with the key informant interviews and the community listening sessions, is how are they consuming information, right? So a lot of us don't pay attention. I mean, your listeners and you and I probably pay pretty close attention to how we consume information, and you know, but for the most part, we're just tuning in. We're absorbing messaging all the time without even being aware that we're absorbing messaging. Right. And so having a strategy, actually thinking of all of those touch points, right? So a project that we worked on in North Dakota really focused again around kind of healing some of the polarization, and focused specifically around community wellness, community health. We did a video series where we curated stories. In North Dakota, there is a shortage of health professionals. It's a very rural state, right? Many people appeal to homeopathic healthcare providers, chiropractors, and so on for all of their primary care needs. So we actually had one of these videos, which was sort of appeal from a chiropractor talking about, you know, the vaccine, and you know why she recommends her clients get it, and so on. So again, identifying those barriers and using the appeal and baking that in, but all of the strategy is informed by that story map. So through that process of creating the narrative framework and specifically creating that story map, we knew, okay, we got to find a chiropractor who's open and receptive to the vaccine, and who's willing to have those conversations and go on record and just give her own testimony, share her own experience, rather than giving her sound bites or making sure that she hits specific data points in the conversation. And that carried a lot more weight, right, than even having a public health professional or, someone in the white coat wearing the stethoscope, as far as getting that message out there.
Great, great. And well, it sounds as though that framework can really drill into a lot of different channels, so that you can get that that message, and hear it or see it in multiple interactions through a campaign period. And so whether it's coming in through the mail or through my social feed or through my email, there's a lot of ways to deliver that, and then drive people back to assets like a video from the chiropractor talking about the
100%.
So makes
And
all the sense of the world.
We've actually worked on campaigns where we've developed like kind of DIY kits as well, and essentially set up the parameters, said, this is what we'd like you to talk about, but it's not scripted. It's not, again, as communicators, we have a tendency to be pretty type A on some of this stuff. So it was very hard to relinquish some of that control. But one of the things that we found, Dennis, which was really interesting, this was a campaign that we worked on right at the beginning, right at the start of COVID, specifically around the safe distancing, social distancing, and so on, prior to the vaccine rollout. And we found that some of the community organizers had a lot more sway over the audiences we were trying to reach than even some of the celebrity messaging, right? And so we were scripting, PSAs for some rap stars, for some NBA players, but the things that really carried weight were DIY, phone filmed videos that were being sent by some of these community organizers and activists. And so in order to make sure that we had the parameters in place for that messaging, that we were adhering to the narrative framework, we just created a kit for, here's the things to look out for. Some of it was just, technical, make sure you're, have good equipment and a good setup, and don't have a lot of distracting noise around you, et cetera, et cetera. Others were just the specific points that we would like them to hit, but it was not scripted, it was not polished, it was not edited. It was very frustrating to do, but it was also highly effective.
Yeah. It sounds like it was very authentic. Which at the end of the day means so much more now, as we're surrounded with content that is AI generated and not authentic at all. Very cool. Excellent. Well, Josh, if the audience is interested in getting in touch, how would they get in touch with you? What does a initial conversation look like? How do you typically engage with folks?
Sure. So I think the best way to find me is through the website, oddduck.io, or my email address, which is josh@oddduck.io. Initial conversation, really, very similar to any kind of consulting. I just want to know sort of what the issue is that you're focused on, where you're focused, and what the vision is, what success looks like, what you want to accomplish with it. And that's the initial engagement, is just having that conversation and figuring out how we get there, how we can develop a story map to actually meet those needs and to align all of your channels so that you're telling the same story across these platforms.
Perfect. Exactly. Awesome. Well, Josh Gryniewicz, thanks so much for joining us today. I think that the story that you are bringing to the nonprofit world around this hope-centric messaging and around this entire framework that you've developed is very apropos, given this world that we're living in today, where there's a lot of fear-based messaging going on. I know a lot of nonprofits that I work with are feeling like they're under attack from the federal government and a lot of other places. And so I think, this notion of standing out with a message of hope really resonates in today's environment. So it sounds like you've got a great plan here. So audience, if you want to get in touch with Josh, you can hit him up on the website, oddduck.io, or hit him on his email, josh@oddduck.io. We'll include that in the show notes, of course. Josh, thanks so much for joining me today. I thought this was great. And we'll look forward to seeing some more hopeful appeals out there over the next year. So really appreciate you joining me.
Thank you, Dennis. Appreciate it.